Along the Mississippi River Delta in Louisiana, there exists a document that has puzzled historians for over a century, a property deed filed in the autumn of 1852 that records something that should have been impossible under every law of the antebellum South. A man named Moses, who had been born into slavery on Plantation, became the legal owner of that same plantation just 8 months after his master's death. But the story doesn't end there. In a twist that defied all social order of the time, Moses married his former master's widow, a white woman from a respected Creole family, just 40 days after the funeral. The parish clerk who recorded their marriage license wrote in the margin, "God have mercy on us all." Within the first year of Moses's freedom, 6 people who questioned his rapid rise to power died under circumstances the authorities refused to investigate thoroughly. His former master, Henry Bosson, was found dead with a hunting rifle across his lap. Yet details in the sealed coroner's report contradicted the official suicide verdict. The 2 white overseers who challenged Moses's authority both died within months of each other. A priest who tried to intervene was killed in what officials called a riding accident. By 1853, Moses Beauchamp, the name he adopted after marrying the widow, controlled one of the wealthiest estates in Ascension Parish. The question that haunted everyone who knew the story was simple but terrifying. How many people had died to make this impossible transformation possible? Before we continue with the story of Moses and the blood-soaked path that led from slave quarters to plantation master, I want to hear from you. Subscribe to this channel if you're fascinated by the darkest chapters of American history, and leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. This is a story that was deliberately buried for generations, and your engagement helps bring these forgotten truths to light. The events I'm about to share with you have been pieced together from parish records, personal letters, account books, and testimony given during a closed inquiry that few people know ever existed. What happened at Plantation challenges everything we think we know about power, loyalty, and survival in the Old South. Plantation stood on a bend of the Mississippi River in Ascension Parish, Louisiana, where the soil ran black and rich enough to grow sugarcane that fetched premium prices in New Orleans. The estate sprawled across nearly 800 acres, its boundaries marked by ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss that seemed to absorb the heavy Louisiana air. The main house rose 3 stories tall, built in the French colonial style with wide galleries wrapping around each floor, tall windows that opened to catch the river breeze, and columns that had weathered hurricanes for 3 generations. Henry Beauchamp had inherited Beller from his father in 1838, along with 63 enslaved people, a sugar mill that processed cane from neighboring plantations, and debts that would have crushed a lesser man. But Henry was not a lesser man. He was ambitious, calculating, and possessed of a particular kind of intelligence that recognized opportunity in places others saw only obstacles. By 1850, he had expanded his holdings to 92 slaves, paid off his father's debts, and established himself among the parish's planter elite. His success stemmed partly from agricultural innovation. He was among the first in the region to adopt steam-powered equipment for his sugar mill, but more significantly from his willingness to observe and learn from those he owned. Moses had been born on Beller in 1822, the son of a woman named Patience who worked in the main house and a father whose name was never recorded in the estate books. From childhood, Moses displayed qualities that both fascinated and unsettled those around him. He learned to read by watching Enres children study with their tutor, memorizing lessons through the parlor window. He taught himself carpentry by observing the plantation's craftsmen, then surpassed their skill before his 15th birthday. He understood crop rotation, weather patterns, and the complex economics of sugar production better than many overseers. Most remarkably, he possessed an ability to read people, to understand their fears, desires, and weaknesses with an accuracy that seemed almost preternatural. Charamp recognized Moses's intelligence early and made a decision that most planters would have considered dangerous. He gave Moses responsibility, first as a driver overseeing field hands, then as a mill operator, and eventually as his personal assistant in managing the estate's business affairs. Ori kept Moses close, relied on his judgment, trusted him with information that other slaves never accessed. It was an arrangement that benefited both men. Ori's profits increased significantly under Moses's efficient management, while Moses gained knowledge and influence impossible for someone in his position. But there was a complexity to their relationship that outsiders could not fully perceive. Henry's wife Celeste had arrived at Beller in 1845, the 19-year-old daughter of a declining Creole family in New Orleans. Her father had accumulated gambling debts that threatened to destroy the family's reputation, and marrying her to the wealthy Henry Bosham, 15 years her senior, had been a strategic solution. Celeste brought beauty, refinement, and social connections to Beller. She brought no affection for her husband. The plantation's social structure in 1852 Louisiana was rigidly defined by law and custom. Yet within that rigid structure existed countless subtle negotiations of power. The white overseers, men like Tobias Greenleaf and his brother Samuel, officially held authority over all enslaved workers, but in practice Moses wielded more influence. He controlled access to Henry, managed work assignments, and maintained the account books that tracked every aspect of plantation operations. The Greenleaf brothers resented this arrangement deeply, but Henry dismissed their complaints with a pragmatism that infuriated them. Moses made him money, and money mattered more than their wounded pride. The household staff included 12 people who worked in the main house, and they occupied a strange middle ground in the plantation's hierarchy. Louisa, who had served as Henry's nurse when he was a child and now managed the household, commanded respect from both white and black residents. Her daughter, Margaret, worked as Celeste's personal maid and occupied a position that gave her intimate knowledge of the mistress's private life. The kitchen was ruled by old Jack, a man of indeterminate age who had cooked for 3 generations of Bon, and whom everyone treated with cautious deference. By the spring of 1852, Beller appeared to be thriving. The previous harvest had been exceptional. Henry had negotiated favorable contracts with New Orleans factors, and the plantation's reputation attracted buyers willing to pay premium prices. The main house hosted dinner parties where parish elite gathered to discuss politics, cotton futures, and the growing tensions between North and South. Henry spoke passionately about states' rights and the Southern way of life, never acknowledging the irony that his eloquent defenses of that way of life were often informed by observations and insights Moses had shared with him earlier that same day. But beneath this prosperous surface, tensions were building that would soon tear Beller apart. Moses had spent 30 years watching, learning, and waiting. He understood the plantation's operations better than Henry himself. He knew which neighboring planters were on the verge of bankruptcy, which factors in New Orleans could be manipulated, which laws could be exploited, and which people could be influenced. He had been preparing for something, though few suspected what or when it would come. What no one fully understood, what perhaps even Moses himself did not fully understand until it was too late, was how completely the plantation's careful hierarchy would collapse once a single crucial element was removed. The entire structure of Bellerev rested on Henry Bossom's authority, and that authority rested on nothing more substantial than tradition, law, and the collective agreement that it should be so. Remove that foundation and everything built upon it would have to be renegotiated. The summer of 1852 would reveal just how fragile that foundation truly was. The evening of June 17, 1852 began like countless others at Bellere. The day's heat had been oppressive even by Louisiana standards, driving everyone to seek shade by mid-after afternoon. Orichamp had spent the day reviewing account books with Moses, going over figures for the upcoming planting season, and discussing a potential land purchase from a neighboring planter whose son's gambling debts had grown unmanageable. They had worked in Ori's study, a room on the second floor of the main house that overlooked the river, its windows open to catch whatever breeze might stir the thick air. Celeste had complained of a headache and remained in her chambers for most of the day, attended only by Margot. This was not unusual. Celeste frequently retreated from the household, claiming various ailments that required privacy and rest. The household staff had learned not to disturb her during these episodes, though Louisa sometimes muttered that a woman who ate so little and slept so much was inviting illness rather than recovering from it. At 7:00, Henry dismissed Moses and called for his evening meal to be brought to his study. He had letters to write, he said, and preferred to work undisturbed. This, too, was not unusual. Ori often conducted business correspondence in the evening, particularly during the planting and harvest seasons. Louisa supervised as Jack prepared a tray with cold chicken, bread, cheese, and a bottle of HR preferred claret. Margaret carried the tray upstairs, knocked on the study door, received HR acknowledgement, and left it on the table just inside the entrance. What happened in the hours that followed has been reconstructed from testimony given during the inquiry, though significant gaps remain in the account. At approximately 9:30, Tobias Greenleaf, making his evening rounds of the property, noticed that lamplight still burned in Henry's study. This detail would later prove important, though at the time it seemed unremarkable. At some point between 9:30 and 11:00, someone entered Henry's study. The door had been locked from the inside, but whoever entered possessed either a key or the ability to persuade Henry to unlock it. At 11:45, Louisa was awakened by a sound she described as something heavy falling. She rose, lit a candle, and made her way through the dark house toward Henry's study. The door stood slightly ajar. She was certain it had been closed when she passed by earlier and lamplight spilled into the hallway. She pushed the door open and saw Henry Bosham slumped in his desk chair, his head thrown back at an unnatural angle, his hunting rifle across his lap, and a significant amount of blood on the wall behind him. Louisa's scream brought the household running. Within minutes, Moses, Celeste, Margot, the Greenleaf brothers, and several house servants had gathered in the study. The scene appeared straightforward. Henry had shot himself with his own rifle, the barrel placed beneath his chin. The weapon was one he kept mounted above his desk, a Kentucky long rifle that had belonged to his grandfather. Powder burns marked his chin and throat, and the bullet had exited through the top of his skull, lodging in the ceiling beam above. Tobias Greenleaf immediately assumed command of the situation, as was expected given his position as senior overseer. He ordered everyone except Samuel out of the room, then dispatched a rider to fetch Dr. Macias Fentress from his home 5 miles distant. He questioned Lycia about who had been in the house that evening, and who might have heard anything unusual. He examined the study for signs of disturbance and found none. No overturned furniture, no indication of struggle, no forced entry. Dr. Fentress arrived shortly after 1:00 in the morning. He examined the body briefly, confirmed the obvious cause of death, and estimated that Henry had been dead approximately 2 to 3 hours. He noted the powder burns, the trajectory of the bullet, and the position of the body. His initial conclusion, recorded in his notes, was suicide. However, he also observed several details that troubled him enough to include them in a separate, more detailed report he would later submit to the parish coroner. First, Henry's hands showed no powder residue beyond what one would expect from recently handling the rifle. Second, the rifle had been found across Henry's lap in a position that seemed awkward for someone who had just used it to shoot himself. Third, a bottle of claret on the desk was nearly empty, but Henry was known as a moderate drinker who rarely consumed more than 2 glasses with dinner. Fourth, and most disturbing, Henry's face bore an expression that Dr. Fentress struggled to characterize, not the blank emptiness of sudden death, but something that resembled profound surprise mixed with what the doctor could only describe as recognition, as if Henry had understood something important in his final moment. The household spent the remainder of that night in a state of controlled chaos. Celeste, after viewing her husband's body, had become hysterical, screaming, tearing at her hair, and requiring restraint by both Louisa and Margaret before Dr. Fentress could administer laudanum. The Greenleaf brothers posted themselves in the study as guards, though what they were guarding against was unclear. Moses took charge of practical arrangements, sending riders to notify Henry's brother in Baton Rouge and the parish priest, organizing the household staff to begin preparations for the funeral, and ensuring that nothing in the study was disturbed until proper authorities could investigate. It was Moses's calm efficiency during this crisis that first raised suspicions in Tobias Greenleaf's mind. A man's master had just died violently, yet Moses showed no visible distress, no disruption to his usual methodical competence. He gave orders as if he had anticipated this moment, as if he had already thought through every necessary step. When Greenleaf mentioned this observation to his brother later that morning, Samuel responded with a question that would echo through subsequent events. "How long do you think Moses has been waiting for this?" The official investigation began at dawn. Sheriff Antoine Tiro arrived from the parish seat accompanied by 2 deputies and a justice of the peace named Aldrich Budrow. They examined the study, questioned the household, and reviewed Dr. Fentress' preliminary findings. By noon, they had reached their conclusion. Henry Bosch had taken his own life while intoxicated and despondent over financial troubles. The verdict satisfied legal requirements and preserved the family's reputation. Suicide was scandal enough without adding suggestions of foul play or household conspiracy, but several people found the official verdict difficult to accept. Tobias Greenleaf insisted that Henry had shown no signs of despondency and had in fact been enthusiastic about upcoming business ventures. Henry's brother, Armand, who arrived late on the 18th, pointed out that the family's finances were actually quite healthy, something he verified by reviewing the estate's account books with Moses. Dr. Fentress privately maintained his reservations about certain physical evidence, and Louisa, who had served the Beauchamp family for 45 years, told anyone who would listen that Henry was not the type of man who would abandon his responsibilities through suicide, no matter what troubles he faced. Yet the inquiry was closed, the death certificate was signed, and preparations for Henry's burial proceeded. According to Louisiana law and Catholic custom, he should have been interred quickly, but the heat was intense, and Armand insisted on delaying the funeral until more family members could travel from New Orleans. Henry's body was placed in a sealed coffin in the Plantation's ice house, and the funeral was scheduled for June 22nd. During those 5 days between death and burial, Beller Plantation existed in a strange state of suspension. All normal work continued, the fields still required tending, the mill still operated, the household still functioned, but everyone understood that fundamental change was coming. The question was what form that change would take. Armand had legal authority as Henry's closest male relative, but he lived in Baton Rouge and had his own affairs to manage. Celeste was Henry's widow and would inherit significant assets. But Louisiana law restricted women's control over property, and she showed no capacity or desire to manage a plantation. The Greenleaf brothers assumed they would step into positions of greater authority, but they needed someone to sign their orders, someone with legal standing. Moses continued managing daily operations as he had under Henry, and everyone accepted this arrangement because the alternative was chaos. He met with Armand to review accounts, corresponded with Atre's factor in New Orleans about existing contracts, and made decisions about planting schedules that could not wait for resolution of the estate. He did all of this with the same calm competence he had always shown, and people began to forget, or perhaps they never truly believed that his legal status had not changed. He was still enslaved. Every decision he made, every order he gave, every signature he placed on documents had no legal authority whatsoever. On June 21st, the evening before Henry's funeral, Moses requested a private meeting with Celeste. They met in the small parlor off the main hall, the same room where Henry had once conducted business with visiting planters. Margaret stood outside the closed door. Propriety required a witness to any meeting between a white woman and an enslaved man, but she later testified that she could not hear what was discussed. The meeting lasted approximately 45 minutes. When Moses emerged, his expression revealed nothing. When Celeste emerged 10 minutes later, she looked as if she had made a decision that both terrified and relieved her. The funeral took place on a Wednesday afternoon with heat so oppressive that several attendees fainted during the graveside service. Father Dominique Leblanc conducted the ceremony, speaking of Henry's contributions to the parish, his business acumen, and his devotion to the Southern cause. He did not mention suicide. Such things were not discussed openly, but everyone present understood the implications of the carefully chosen words about God's mercy and the mysterious trials that test even the strongest souls. Armand Beauchamp departed immediately after the funeral, explaining that urgent business required his return to Baton Rouge. Before leaving, he had a brief conversation with Tobias Greenleaf, in which he stated that the plantation's management would remain under current arrangements until the estate was properly settled. What those current arrangements were exactly, he did not specify. Greenleaf understood that he was being told to accept Moses's continued authority, at least temporarily, and this understanding did nothing to diminish his growing resentment. That evening, as the household was settling after the exhausting day, Louisa was cleaning Henry's study, a task she had delayed as long as possible, when she noticed something that stopped her cold. The hunting rifle that had killed HRI was back in its usual place above the desk. She was certain it had been taken as evidence by Sheriff Theot. She was even more certain that she had not seen anyone return it. She mentioned this to Moses, who told her that Armand had arranged for its return before departing. This explanation was reasonable, yet something about the way Moses delivered it, or perhaps something about the way the rifle now hung, cleaned and oiled, as if waiting to be used again, left Louisa profoundly uneasy. One other detail from that day deserves mention. Late in the evening, after most of the household had retired, Margaret was helping Celeste prepare for bed, when she noticed that her mistress was wearing a necklace Margot had never seen before. It was a simple piece, a gold chain with a small locket, old-fashioned in style, but well crafted. When Margaret asked about it, Celeste touched it absently and said it had belonged to her grandmother. Margaret did not press the question, though she thought it odd that Celeste would choose to wear a new piece of jewelry on the day of her husband's funeral. She did not know, could not have known, that inside the locket was a small curl of dark hair and a folded paper containing 7 words written in Moses's distinctive hand. "What we have begun cannot be undone." The weeks following Enra's death revealed fractures in Beller's social structure that had always existed beneath the surface, but had been held in check by the weight of established authority. With that authority removed, every relationship, every assumption, every unspoken arrangement came into question. The plantation did not collapse immediately. That would come later, but it began a slow transformation that alarmed everyone who understood what they were witnessing. Moses continued to run Beller's operations with an efficiency that even the Greenleaf brothers could not fault. The crops were tended, the mill operated profitably, contracts with New Orleans factors were maintained, and the estate's accounts showed continued income. On paper, nothing had changed. In practice, everything had changed. Moses no longer sought approval for his decisions, no longer presented plans for someone else to authorize. He simply acted, and the momentum of habit and the absence of clear alternative authority meant that people accepted his actions as legitimate. Celeste remained secluded in the main house, appearing only for meals and necessary social obligations. She met weekly with Father Leblanc, who visited to provide spiritual comfort during her mourning period. She received condolence calls from neighboring plantation wives, though these visits became less frequent as rumors began to circulate about her relationship with Moses. She wore black, observed the proper forms of widowhood, and gave no outward indication that she was anything other than a grieving wife awaiting settlement of her husband's estate. But those who worked in the main house knew better. Margaret, whose position as Celeste's personal maid gave her intimate access to her mistress's private life, observed meetings between Celeste and Moses that occurred with increasing frequency and decreasing pretense of propriety. They met in the parlor in Ori's former study on the gallery in the evening. They spoke in low voices, sometimes in French, which Moses had somehow learned despite having no formal education. They reviewed documents together, documents that Margaret glimpsed but could not read, papers covered with legal language and official seals. Louisa noticed changes in the household's operation that suggested a shift in authority. Celeste began making decisions about provisions, about which servants should be assigned to which tasks, about matters that widows typically left to male relatives or overseers. But her decisions were never announced directly. They came through Moses, delivered with such matter-of-fact confidence that people complied before questioning whether Celeste actually had the authority to make such determinations. The Greenleaf brothers recognized that their position was being undermined, but they struggled to articulate exactly how or to identify a specific violation they could challenge. Moses gave them no direct orders that would have been an inexcusable breach of racial hierarchy. Instead, he simply informed them of decisions that had been made, changes that would be implemented, arrangements that were now in place. When they protested, he referred them to Celeste, who confirmed that yes, these changes had her approval as mistress of the estate. When they questioned whether Celeste had the legal authority to approve such changes, Moses pointed out that the estate was still in probate and that Armand Beauchamp had explicitly stated that current arrangements should continue. By late July, Tobias Greenleaf had become convinced that Moses was manipulating Celeste, possibly through threats, possibly through some other form of coercion he could not quite define. He shared these suspicions with his brother, with several neighboring overseers, and eventually with Sheriff Theot during a chance meeting in the parish seat. The sheriff listened politely, but pointed out that suspicion was not evidence, and unless Greenleaf could demonstrate actual wrongdoing, actual crime, there was nothing the law could do. The sheriff also reminded him with careful emphasis that making unfounded accusations about a white woman's honor could have severe legal consequences for the accuser. On August 3rd, something occurred that brought these simmering tensions to a brief, explosive confrontation. Moses had arranged the sale of 60 hogsheads of sugar to a New Orleans factor at a price significantly higher than Henry had negotiated for the previous year's crop. This was objectively good business, but Tobias Greenleaf chose to challenge the transaction, arguing that Moses had no authority to negotiate contracts and that the sale should be voided. Moses calmly explained that he had negotiated the deal on Celeste's behalf with her full knowledge and approval, and that the contract had already been signed and the first payment received. Greenleaf, his frustration finally boiling over, made the mistake of explicitly stating what many had been thinking. "You forget your place, Moses. You forget what you are." The confrontation took place in the mill office with half a dozen witnesses present. Moses's response was quiet, measured, and absolutely devastating in its precision. "My place is wherever Madame Bosham determines it to be. If you question my authority, you question hers. If you question hers, you question the arrangements made by M. Shore Arm before his departure. If you wish to challenge those arrangements, I suggest you travel to Baton Rouge and discuss the matter with him directly. Until you do so, I will continue to perform the duties assigned to me by the mistress of this estate." It was a masterful piece of verbal maneuvering, simultaneously invoking multiple sources of authority while offering no direct challenge to the racial hierarchy that everyone understood governed their world. Greenleaf was trapped. He could not challenge Moses without appearing to challenge Celeste, could not challenge Celeste without appearing to exceed his own authority, could not appeal to Arm, and without admitting that he had lost control of the plantation he was supposed to be supervising. That same evening, Tobias Greenleaf began drafting a letter to Armand Bosham detailing his concerns about Moses's growing influence and requesting clarification about the estate's management structure. He was still working on this letter when 2 days later he fell ill with symptoms that Dr. Fentress initially diagnosed as cholera, severe intestinal distress accompanied by vomiting, fever, and delirium. The illness came on suddenly, progressed rapidly, and proved fatal within 48 hours. Tobias Greenleaf died on August 7, 1852, 3 days after his confrontation with Moses. Cholera was not uncommon in Louisiana during summer months, particularly near the river. The same week Greenleaf died. 2 slaves from a neighboring plantation and a merchant in the parish seat also succumbed to similar symptoms. Dr. Fentress saw no reason to suspect foul play, though he noted in his records that the speed and severity of Greenleaf's decline was unusual, even for cholera. The body was buried quickly. The heat and the nature of the illness made this necessary, and Samuel Greenleaf found himself suddenly elevated to the position of sole overseer. Samuel lacked his brother's forceful personality and his certainty about how things should be. He had relied on Tobias to make difficult decisions, to confront problems directly, to maintain the firm hand that everyone agreed was necessary in managing a large plantation. Without his brother, Samuel felt adrift. When Moses approached him 3 days after the funeral with a proposal to restructure the overseer's responsibilities, ostensibly to reduce Samuel's workload during this difficult period, Samuel agreed without fully considering the implications. The new arrangement gave Samuel authority over field operations while Moses retained control of business affairs, contracts, and financial management. It was, Moses explained, simply a formal recognition of how things had been operating. Anyway, what Samuel did not realize until too late was that he had just accepted a subordinate position. The person who controls money and contracts controls everything else. Moses now had official, or at least officially recognized, authority over the plantation's most important operations, while Samuel was relegated to supervising manual labor. It was a complete inversion of the normal hierarchy, accomplished so smoothly that Samuel only understood what had happened after the arrangement was already in place and functioning. Throughout these developments, one person watched with increasingly sharp attention and growing alarm. Old Jack, who had cooked for the Beauchamp family for longer than most people on the plantation, had been alive, had seen changes of power before. He had watched Omri's father die, and Hri assumed control. He had observed hirings and firings, marriages and deaths, the constant small negotiations of authority that occurred in any large household. But what he was witnessing now was different. This was not evolution. This was revolution conducted so gradually that most people did not recognize it as such. Jack began paying attention to things that others overlooked. He noticed that Celeste no longer took her meals in the formal dining room, but instead ate in her private chambers, with Margaret bringing trays that Moses had personally selected from Jack's kitchen. He observed that Margaret carried notes between Moses and Celeste several times each day, more communication than would seem necessary for simple household management. He saw that Louisa, who had once held undisputed authority over the household staff, now consulted with Moses before making decisions about staffing or supplies. Most troubling of all, Jack noticed that people were disappearing. Not literally disappearing, nothing so dramatic, but gradually being removed from positions where they might observe or interfere with whatever was unfolding. 3 house servants had been reassigned to fieldwork, a change that Moses explained as necessary due to reduced household needs during mourning. 2 field workers known for their loyalty to the Greenleaf brothers had been sold to a neighboring plantation, a transaction Moses described as financially advantageous. The butler, who had served Henry for 15 years, had been dismissed for drunkenness, a charge that Louisa privately disputed but could not disprove. When Jack mentioned these observations to Louisa, she responded with something that surprised him. "Fear, not anger, not indignation, but genuine fear. Do not speak of these things," she told him. "Do not even think them too loudly. There are changes coming that we cannot prevent, and the only safety is in not noticing them." On September 12, 1852, exactly 12 weeks after Henry Bossam's death, Moses appeared before Justice Budrow in the parish seat, accompanied by Celeste and a lawyer from New Orleans named Edward Lafleur. The purpose of their visit was to present documents related to Henry's estate, and to request the court's approval of certain arrangements. The documents included Henry's will, which had apparently been revised just 2 months before his death, a power of attorney granting Celeste authority to manage the estate during probate, and a manumission paper for Moses signed by Henry and dated April 15, 1852. The will was straightforward enough. It left the bulk of Henry's estate to Celeste with provisions for his brother Armand and small bequests to several friends and distant relatives. Nothing in the will was unusual for a man without children. The power of attorney was also unremarkable, giving Celeste broad authority to conduct business on the estate's behalf during the probate period. The manumission paper was more problematic. It stated that Henry Beauchamp, in recognition of Moses's faithful service, exceptional intelligence, and invaluable contributions to the prosperity of Beller Plantation, hereby granted him freedom to take effect immediately. It was properly executed with Henry's signature and the required witness signatures, but it had never been filed with the parish clerk, as Louisiana law required for manumissions to be legally valid. Moses's lawyer argued that this was a mere technicality, that Henry had clearly intended to grant freedom and had executed the proper document, and the failure to file was an administrative oversight that should not invalidate in res explicit wishes. Justice Budrow was not a naive man. He understood that he was looking at a situation that violated every norm of Louisiana society, that challenged assumptions about race and power that formed the foundation of the entire system. He also understood that he was being presented with technically legal documents properly executed and notarized. He could reject them. He had the authority to do so, but on what grounds? Because the situation made him uncomfortable. Because it seemed suspicious, because it violated unwritten rules about how things should be. After considerable deliberation, Justice Budrow accepted the documents for filing. He approved the manumission, granted Celeste the requested authority, and entered the will into probate. In his private journal that evening, he wrote, "I have today performed an act that may haunt me for the rest of my life. I have set in motion events that I suspect will not end well, but I have been presented with legal documents that meet all requirements of law, and I have no basis on which to reject them. May God forgive me if I have been deceived, and may He protect those who may suffer from my decision." The news of Moses's manumission spread through the parish with remarkable speed. Reactions ranged from disbelief to outrage to a kind of fascinated horror. Neighboring planters began avoiding contact with Belelarive, treating it as if it were contaminated. The parish elite, who had once attended Henry's dinner parties, now refused invitations to visit. Father LeBlanc continued his pastoral visits to Celeste, but he made clear his deep reservations about the situation and urged her repeatedly to consider the consequences of her choices. Samuel Greenleaf, upon hearing that Moses was now legally free, submitted his resignation effective immediately. He could not, he said, continue working under such circumstances. Moses accepted his resignation with perfect politeness and hired a new overseer within a week, a man named Amos Pritchett, who had worked on plantations in Mississippi, and who seemed either ignorant of or indifferent to the unconventional arrangement at Beller. Throughout all of these developments, Moses maintained the same calm demeanor he had always shown. He conducted business, managed operations, and spoke with unfailing courtesy to everyone. He made no dramatic gestures, issued no proclamations, engaged in no behavior that could be characterized as insolent or presumptuous. He simply continued doing what he had been doing, with the single but monumental difference that he now did it as a free man. The question that everyone asked, that some asked openly and others only in whispers, was how this had happened. How had Moses convinced Henry to sign a manumission paper? How had he obtained Henry's revised will? How had he persuaded Celeste to support his freedom and to work with him in managing the estate? The obvious answer, the answer most people assumed, was that Moses had somehow manipulated or coerced these things through threats, blackmail, or exploitation of Celeste's grief and vulnerability. But a few people, those who had observed most closely, suspected something more complex and more disturbing. They suspected that Moses had spent years, perhaps his entire life, preparing for this moment, that he had studied Henry so thoroughly that he understood exactly how to present himself as indispensable, that he had cultivated Celeste's trust and possibly her affection through calculated attention over months or years, that he had positioned himself so strategically that when Ori died, he was the only person who could hold the estate together, making his freedom and authority necessary rather than simply desired. And beneath these suspicions lay an even more troubling question that few people dared to voice. Had Rebosham really taken his own life, or had Moses engineered his death so skillfully that it appeared to be suicide? The official investigation had been cursory, the evidence circumstantial, the conclusion convenient. Dr. Fentress reservations had been noted, but never seriously pursued. The hunting rifle had been returned to its place above the desk with suspicious speed, and the one person who had directly challenged Moses's authority, Tobias Greenleaf, had died suddenly just days after that challenge. These questions had no answers, only implications, and the implications were terrifying enough that most people preferred not to think about them too carefully. It was easier to accept the official explanations, to believe that Henry had succumbed despair that Moses had simply been fortunate, that Celeste was a confused widow making poor decisions under the influence of grief. But late at night, when people were alone with their thoughts, many of them wondered if Moses could transform himself from slave to free man, from property to property owner in the space of 3 months. What else might he be capable of? And if he had been willing to do whatever it took to achieve this transformation, anything at all, how many people had already paid the price for his ambition, and how many more would pay before the story reached its end? The autumn of 1852 brought cooler weather, but no reduction in the tension surrounding Bella. The plantation continued to operate profitably, the crops were harvested successfully, and Moses's management proved as competent as it had been under Henry's ownership. But the social isolation of the estate deepened. Neighboring planters refused to conduct business with Bella. Merchants in the parish seat provided necessary supplies, but did so with cold formality. The few visitors who came were strangers, factors from New Orleans, lawyers, businessmen who cared more about profit than propriety. What do you think is unfolding at Bella? The evidence suggests something darker than anyone dared speak aloud. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because the most disturbing revelations are still to come. The true nature of what was occurring at Bella became impossible to ignore on November 28, 1852, when Celeste Beauchamp and Moses appeared together at the parish clerk's office to file an application for a marriage license. The clerk, a man named Prosper Gautier, who had held his position for 23 years, initially assumed he had misunderstood their request. When Moses calmly repeated it, Gautier's hands began to shake. Moses pointed out with careful precision that Louisiana law prohibited such marriages for enslaved persons or recently freed people of color. He was neither. His manumission had been filed in September. He had consulted with lawyers in New Orleans and knew exactly which laws applied. After 3 hours of discussion, Gautier found himself unable to identify a specific legal basis to deny the application. The arrangements involved a defrocked Catholic priest named Father Mature Corbeau, expelled from the diocese 5 years earlier for alcoholism. Corbeau agreed to conduct the wedding for a substantial fee. The ceremony took place on December 19, 1852 in Bella's parlor. The only witnesses were Louisa, Margot, Old-Jack, and the estate's lawyer. Father Corbeau stumbled through the liturgy with breath that smelled of whiskey. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Celeste's hand trembled as Moses placed a gold ring on her finger. By marrying Celeste, Moses gained legal control of her inheritance from Henry, which meant he now effectively owned Bella Plantation. The reaction from the parish elite was immediate and furious. A group of planters met to discuss action. Some argued for violence, others for legal intervention. They settled on complete social and economic isolation. No one would do business with Bella, but Moses had anticipated this response. His factor in New Orleans was Joachim Tessier, an ambitious trader who cared more about profit than propriety. Tessier had connections to northern buyers, happy to purchase Louisiana sugar without concerning themselves with local scandals. The winter of 1852-1853 saw Bella operating in complete isolation from its neighbors, but in growing connection to commercial networks beyond the parish. Celeste remained largely secluded in the main house, appearing in public only when necessary. Those who saw her described her as pale, thin, and emotionally withdrawn. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice was flat and effectless. Margot, who continued serving as her personal maid, observed that Celeste seemed relieved by her new situation. Moses made all decisions, bore all responsibility, faced all conflict. Celeste simply existed in a state of passive acceptance. During the first months of 1853, several incidents suggested Moses was consolidating control by removing potential threats. In February, a field worker named Josiah claimed to have information about what really happened to Master Henry. Before he could share it, he disappeared. Moses reported him as a runaway. In March, old Jacques became ill with symptoms similar to those that had killed Tobias Greenleaf. Severe intestinal distress, rapid decline, death within days. Samuel Greenleaf, now working in the parish seat, began collecting testimony from people who had lived at Beller. He was convinced Moses had murdered Henry and possibly others. He interviewed former servants and examined parish records. On April 12, 1853, Samuel was found dead in his rented room. The official cause was apoplexy, sudden heart failure. He was 38 years old with no history of health problems. All of his notes and documents relating to Beller had vanished. Dr. Fentress noted in his private records that this was the fourth sudden death connected to Beller in less than a year. The pattern troubled him deeply, but he had no medical evidence of foul play. In any case, he scheduled a meeting with Sheriff Theot to discuss his concerns. Before that meeting could occur, Moses visited him. They spoke for approximately 2 hours about medical matters. Then Moses made a statement the doctor would never forget. You understand that the world operates according to natural laws. Sometimes people die for reasons that are perfectly natural, but appear suspicious to those who don't understand the complexity of human mortality. It would be unfortunate if such misunderstandings led a respected physician to make accusations he could not substantiate. It was not explicitly a threat, but the implication was clear. Dr. Prevententric cancelled his meeting with the sheriff. He never spoke publicly about his suspicions. In his private journal he wrote, "I have today chosen cowardice over courage. I suspect I have allowed evil to continue unchecked because I lack the strength to confront it." By summer 1853, Moses had achieved something impossible. He had gone from enslaved property to free man to legal owner of one of the most valuable plantations in the parish, all in 13 months. The cost, measured in human lives, remained unknown, but was suspected to be substantial. What do you think is unfolding at Beller? The evidence suggests something darker than anyone dared speak aloud. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because the most disturbing revelations are still to come. The winter of 1853-1854 brought growing pressure from multiple directions. In January, planters sent a petition to the state legislature requesting tighter restrictions on manumission. The petition didn't mention Moses by name, but everyone understood its target. The legislature debated but ultimately took no action. The first serious threat came in March 1854 when a New Orleans lawyer named Philip Duffer appeared claiming to represent Henner's distant relatives in France. They were challenging the validity of Henner's will, arguing he had been mentally incompetent or under duress when he revised it. The lawsuit aimed to overturn Moses's control by attacking Celeste's inheritance. Moses hired Chalner, a prominent New Orleans lawyer. The legal battle proceeded through spring 1854. In April, a barn at Beller caught fire in the middle of the night, destroying equipment and nearly spreading to the sugar mill. The fire had started in 3 separate locations simultaneously, suggesting arson. In May, someone shot at Moses as he rode along the plantation road. The shot missed and the shooter escaped. The most significant development involved Margot. Her position gave her intimate knowledge of everything occurring in the main house. In June 1854, she approached Father LeBlanc during a pastoral visit. She told him she believed Moses had murdered Henry and that she had evidence. Letters between Celeste and Moses that predated Henry's death by several months. The letters demonstrated a relationship that was intimate and conspiratorial, focused on shared plans for the future. Margaret had hidden these letters, intending to present them to authorities. Father LeBlanc was deeply disturbed. He wrote a letter to the bishop in New Orleans describing the situation and requesting advice. That letter was intercepted before it reached the bishop. On the night of June 23rd, Father LeBlanc was found unconscious on the road between Beller and his church. His horse was nearby, apparently having thrown its rider. The priest died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. The official explanation was a tragic accident. Margaret understood immediately what had happened. She took the letters and documents she had hidden and fled Bel in the middle of the night, heading toward New Orleans. She made it approximately 15 miles before she was found. The official account stated she had been detained by a patrol watching for runaways. During detention, she became agitated and violent, suffering fatal injuries in the struggle. The documents she had been carrying were lost. No investigation was conducted. Celeste did not attend her burial. Moses sent a wreath. In August, the lawsuit reached a critical phase. Depositions would take place in September, representing a significant threat to Moses's position. The night before they were scheduled to begin, Philip Duffra was attacked in his hotel room. 2 men beat him severely and stole all his legal papers. Dwayne survived, but was left with permanent injuries that ended his career. The attackers were never identified. With Dufresne incapacitated and his documentation destroyed, the lawsuit collapsed. In October 1854, the court dismissed the challenge. Moses had won again, but the attack on Duffra marked a turning point. Everyone now understood that Moses was not simply fortunate. He was willing to kill anyone who threatened his position. In November, Colonel Agagaston Chevalier organized a meeting of planters to discuss the Bel situation. 23 men attended. They discussed options ranging from legal challenges to extralegal violence. A committee was formed, 3 men who would plan to eliminate Moses in a way that could be attributed to accident. Moses learned about the meeting within 48 hours. He hired guards from New Orleans and transformed Bel into a fortress. He varied his routines, never traveled alone, never followed predictable patterns. In December 1854, Lucien Broussard, one of the 3 men on the assassination committee, was found dead in his home, killed by a shotgun blast through a window. The investigation concluded it was a hunting accident, but the message was clear. Moses knew who was planning to kill him. On Christmas Eve, someone fired 6 shots at Moses as he returned to Bel. His guards returned fire. 2 people were killed, one of Moses's guards and one attacker identified as a man employed by Etienne Marchon. Marchon fled the parish that night and was never seen in Louisiana again. Colonel Chevalier survived 3 more weeks before dying in January 1855, officially from pneumonia, though his symptoms resembled the intestinal illness that had killed others who opposed Moses. By early 1855, Moses had eliminated or driven away everyone who had actively threatened him. He had proven he could not be dislodged, could not be killed, could not be defeated, but this victory came at a cost. Bel existed in complete social isolation. Moses had what he wanted: freedom, property, power, but he had it in a prison of his own making, surrounded by guards, living with a wife who barely spoke. By spring 1859, Moses had been effective master of Bel for nearly 7 years. The estate continued generating profits, though isolation had taken its toll. Celeste's mental state had deteriorated dramatically. She rarely left her chambers, spoke to people who weren't present, moved through the house like a ghost. Dr. Fentress could offer no diagnosis beyond melancholia. In May 1859, Louisa died peacefully at age 72. She left behind a sealed letter addressed to Dr. Fentress. It contained her account of everything she had witnessed: the mysterious meetings, the suspicious deaths, the systematic elimination of anyone who might challenge Moses. It was not legal evidence, but it provided a comprehensive narrative of Moses's transformation through calculated murder. Dr. Fentress read the letter and faced the decision that had haunted him for years. He chose to make a copy, seal the original with instructions to open it after his death, and deposit it with his lawyer in New Orleans. If Moses killed him, at least the truth would eventually emerge, but Moses did not kill him. By summer 1859, Moses seemed to have lost interest in eliminating threats. In August 1859, Moses announced he would free all enslaved. People remaining on the plantation, immediate and complete freedom for 73 people. The economic implications were staggering. Belleriv's entire labor force would disappear, making continued operation impossible, but Moses proceeded anyway, filing manumission papers and making arrangements for those who wanted to leave. The decision mystified observers. Moses had realized that continuing to operate Bellerive as a slave plantation made him complicit in the same system that had enslaved him. Freeing the people he owned was an attempt to break that cycle, to prove his transformation meant something beyond mere role reversal. Without enslaved labor, the fields could not be worked. The mill could not be operated. By October 1859, Moses had essentially dismantled the economic engine that had made Beller valuable. Celeste's condition reached crisis. In September, she stopped eating entirely. Dr. Fentress found her in profound physical and mental collapse, conscious but unresponsive, existing in a state between life and death. Celeste died on October 17, 1859, 7 years and 4 months after Henry's death. The official cause was wasting disease and melancholia. Moses did not attend the funeral, sending only a wreath and a note. May she find the peace that eluded her in life. After Celeste's death, Moses was sole owner of Beller. He had finally achieved absolute control, and he discovered it meant nothing to him. In November, he began selling off parts of Beller, mill, sections of land, equipment, livestock, furniture. By December, only the main house and a few surrounding acres remained. On December 28, 1859, Moses summoned Dr. Fentress. The doctor found him in Henry's study, surrounded by documents, looking physically healthy, but emotionally exhausted. Moses poured brandy and began to speak. What he said, Dr. Fentress would later record in his journal. Moses did not confess to murder, but he spoke about the nature of power, about what it cost to obtain and maintain. He spoke about slavery and freedom, about how both involved forms of control. He spoke about Celeste, about how their relationship had begun years before Henry's death, about how they had planned together to create circumstances allowing them both to escape. He did not say explicitly they had killed Henry, but the implication was clear. He did not detail the other deaths, but he acknowledged that many obstacles were removed and necessary actions were taken. Most disturbing, he spoke about regret. Not moral regret for people killed, but practical regret that his methods had isolated him so completely that victory became indistinguishable from defeat. He had achieved impossible transformation, but created a life that satisfied him less than the one he had escaped. At the end, Moses asked, "If you could know with absolute certainty that a terrible injustice would be corrected through terrible methods, would you accept that bargain? Would you sacrifice others, many others, to achieve something that should never have been denied to you?" Dr. Fentress replied that he did not know. Moses smiled. "That is the correct answer. Anyone who answers confidently does not understand the question." That was the last time Dr. Fentress saw Moses Boscan. On January 12, 1860, Moses disappeared from Beller. He took with him whatever wealth he had accumulated from selling assets. He left no indication of where he was going. The house stood empty for weeks before neighbors noticed it had been abandoned. The remaining property eventually reverted to the state. No one ever saw Moses Beauchamp again. There were rumors, sightings in New Orleans, reports of a wealthy man of color in Mexico, but nothing confirmed. He disappeared as completely as if he had never existed. The story of Moses Boscan became a dark legend in Ascension Parish. People told different versions, emphasizing different elements. Some portrayed Moses as a brilliant tactician who beat an oppressive system. Others described him as a monster who murdered his way to power. The truth preserved in documents discovered decades later was more disturbing than any legend. Dr. Fentress' journal found after his death in 1871 provided a comprehensive account based on direct observations. Lewis's sealed letter offered corroborating details. Together they suggested Moses had been responsible for numerous deaths and that Celeste had aided him, but these documents also revealed something more complex. They showed Moses had been shaped by a system that treated human beings as property, that denied people agency based solely on race, that created conditions where the only path to freedom was through violence. The system had created Moses Bosch by denying him every legitimate avenue to the life he wanted. The legal questions surrounding Bella were never fully resolved. The deaths between 1852 and 1859 remained officially unsolved. No one faced legal consequences except Philip Dufresne, who survived his attack but never practiced law again. In 1868, a northern journalist named Theodore Wexler investigated the Beller story but found most people refused to discuss it. He uncovered one intriguing detail. In 1867, a man matching Moses's description had been seen in Veracruz, Mexico, operating a successful merchant business. The man called himself Morris Beaumont and was accepted as white. Wexler traveled to Veracruz, but found no trace of him. The final piece emerged in 1903 when letters were donated to the Louisiana Historical Society. Among lawyer Lafleur's papers was correspondence with a client who signed only as M.B. The letters dated between 1860 and 1897 discussed financial and legal matters. In one letter from 1889, M.B. wrote, "I have lived for many years now under a different name, free of the burden of who I was and what I did. I have been successful, respected, and I have harmed no one since leaving Louisiana. Yet, I remain haunted by whether my transformation was worth the price others paid. I traded their lives for my freedom, and I cannot determine whether this was justice or crime, revolution or murder." The letter continued, "I know history will judge me harshly if my story is ever fully told. I accept this judgment even as I maintain I had no other path available. The system that enslaved me created the monster who destroyed that system from within. If I am guilty, then slavery itself stands guilty of creating me." Whether these letters were actually written by Moses cannot be proven, but they suggested he survived for at least 37 years after disappearing from Belarive, that he established a new life successfully, and that he spent those years grappling with the moral implications of his transformation. The story became a cautionary tale told differently depending on who was telling it. Some emphasized the danger of upsetting social order, others pointed to it as evidence of slavery's corrupting influence. Still others dismissed it as exaggerated legend. The main house was demolished in 1887. The land was subdivided and sold. By 1900, nothing remained to mark where Beller had stood. The cemetery where Henry and Celeste were buried was neglected for years before being restored in 1956. On Henry's gravestone, Henry Beauchamp 1807-1852, beloved husband and master of Beller. On Celeste Beauchamp 1826-1859, may she rest in peace. No stone marked Moses's grave because no one knew where or when he died. Perhaps he lived many more years under a different name. Perhaps he died shortly after leaving Louisiana. Perhaps he spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder waiting for someone to recognize him. The story leaves us with uncomfortable questions. Was Moses Bossum a hero or a villain? Was his transformation liberation or crime? Were his methods justified by the impossibility of achieving freedom through legitimate means, or do they damn him regardless? Did he prove individuals can overcome oppressive systems? Or did he simply demonstrate that oppression creates monsters? These questions remain relevant because the conditions that created Moses Beauchamp, systems that deny people agency, that distribute power arbitrarily, that force individuals to choose between submission and violence, have never fully disappeared. And wherever those dynamics exist, there will be individuals like Moses, brilliant and ruthless, who refuse to accept their assigned position and who are willing to pay any price, anyone's price, to transform themselves. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Moses Bamp was justified in his actions, or do his methods make him irredeemable? Could he have achieved freedom through other means, or did the system leave him no choice but violence? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts on this dark chapter of Louisiana history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories exploring the shadows of America's past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates history's uncomfortable truths. Remember, the past is never as simple as we want it to be, and understanding its complexity is the only way to avoid repeating its worst mistakes.